Good evening, everybody. We have a very important Unspeakable Bits webinar tonight from MS Ireland, and I'm delighted, as usual, we have our host, Trevis Gleason. We have two great guests. We have Patricia Rickard-Clarke, who's the chair of Safeguarding Ireland, and we have Tim Hanley, the general manager of the HSE Safeguarding Office. So just to let people know that there's a Q&A down in the bottom. So please, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A in the bottom and I'll be feeding the questions throughout it to Trevis, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we can. And just let people know that our next Unspeakable Bits will be the 15th of May. And we'll have a link up on all the MS Ireland social media channels next week for that. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Trevis and he can introduce our great guests tonight. Take care.
Great. Thank you very much. Hello and welcome to this, our third of the 2025 season of the Unspeakable Bits. As Fergal said, I'm your host for the evening, Trevis Gleason. This is our third series, our third year of doing the Unspeakable Bits. And there are a good few folks to thank for their continued support of the program. We thank MS Ireland for affording us this platform to delve into these difficult topics. It's not easy to talk about some of our subject matter, even among family and friends who know us and know about MS. And many of our topics and subject matter were once considered taboo, not only here in Ireland, but in MS communities around the world. And if I'm being honest, I think that many patient advocacy organizations around the world tune in as well, because we are talking about the things that no one else seems to talk about. Having this space and this time to talk about these things that many aren't comfortable hearing, let alone discussing, is an important resource for all of those of us living with MS and co-occurring conditions as well. So, Cormac Hoggett to MS Ireland. Also, it would be absolutely impossible to put on these programs without our expert panelists. We've had leaders in their field from around the globe with us to delve into the unspeakable here, and we thank them, one and all, for their invaluable help with episodes past, this one present, and our future episodes that we'll talk about a little bit later. Speaking of which, all the previous episodes of the Unspeakable Bits webcast are available on the MS Ireland YouTube channel for your viewing and comments. This program will be posted sometime next week as we're headed into the Easter holidays. And Fergal, perhaps you could put up a link to the previous programs there for everyone as well. We invite all of you, as Fergal mentioned, to submit your questions to our panel tonight via the questions tab at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat function. That gets things a little bit messy, and Fergal and I just pretend to be tech savvy, quite frankly. So use the questions tab. Your questions will be put through to me, and then I will present them to the panel. And just so you know, particularly tonight, I will be only doing them anonymously. There will be no names mentioned, so don't worry about that. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a head cold, the one that's going around the country and the world right now, so forgive me there. I did mention our expert panelists, and tonight, with no exception, we have some pretty important people to talk about abuse, neglect, and coercive control. We're grateful to have with us Patricia Rickard-Clarke. Patricia is a solicitor and a fellow of the Institute of Banking, and a member of Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners Special Interest Group on decision-making capacity in London. She's currently, as Fergal said, the chair of Safeguarding Ireland, and she was previously the chair of, is it SAGE or SAG advocacy?
SAGE advocacy.
SAGE
yes.
advocacy. Okay, but Patricia, welcome to the Unspeakable Bits. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us is Tim Hanley. Tim is a qualified social worker and currently is the general manager of the Health Services Executives National Safeguarding Office. And for those of you not in Ireland, we won't keep saying Health Service Executive. It's HSE here, so that's what we're going to call it. He played a key role in supporting the implementation of the HSE Safeguarding Vulnerable Persons at Risk of Abuse policy. Tim, you also are very welcome. Thank you for being here.
Right. Thank you very much for having me on, Travis. Delighted to be here.
So it's a difficult topic, and frankly, one that many people with multiple sclerosis may not have considered that we should be having for ourselves. Maybe we think about it for someone else. I'm not so sure, but maybe what we can do is start by, Patricia, I'll ask you first and ask then you, Tim. Maybe you can introduce us to Safeguarding Ireland as an organization and perhaps how you got involved with the organization.
Sure. Safeguarding Ireland was actually established in December 2015, following the HSE's publication of its Safeguarding Vulnerable Persons at Risk of Abuse, its policy and procedures. And a part of that policy, that policy was published following Arthur Tractor case, which is one of these cases where there was abuse of a person with a disability. And we have no safeguarding legislation, and we had no national policy up to that time. So the HSE published their policy, and as part of that policy, they said it was necessary to have an intersectoral body looking at these issues and obviously promoting the whole issue of adult safeguarding. We have child safeguarding in Ireland, but we've no adult safeguarding legal framework at all. So as I say, we were established at that time. We were established by the HSE, but we became independent of it. So we became a company limited by guarantee, which we are, and we're also a registered charity. We do not provide any service, and we have no staff. We're a voluntary organisation. But at the same time, we have what we call a national safeguarding advisory committee with representatives of about 40 different organisations all over Ireland, and indeed we've a few outside of the Irish jurisdiction as well. And so in terms of our remit then is very much to promote the safeguarding of adults, to protect them from all forms of harm and abuse by individuals, organisations and institutions, and to deliver a national plan for promoting their welfare. Our main objective, though, is to see to the enactment of adult safeguarding legislation. And of course, the 40 groupings or representatives that we have on our advisory committee actually are across the board. They're not confined to health and social care at all. They're sports organisations, voluntary bodies, homeless, human trafficking, quite across the board. We have representatives from those organisations. We also have, in addition to our advisory committee, a smaller group called the State Payments Group. This year, the Department of Social Protection will be paying out about 25 billion in disability benefit or state pensions to older people. And we have a very large element of financial abuse in Ireland as well. So that smaller group is represented by the Department of Social Protection, the Department of Reform and Development Shared Services, which pays pensions to retired public servants, Banking and Payments Federation, which is a representative body of the various banks. We've bank representatives, we've HSE representation, social work, and also the HSE private patients account representative. So it's very representative. And what do? We actually promote by intersectoral collaboration, which is really, really important. We develop public and professional awareness and education. And we undertake research to, again, inform policy and legislation. And our main policy document, if you like, our research, which we published in 2022, was a document called Identifying Risk, Sharing Responsibilities. And that actually goes into quite a bit of detail of the various services that are available, the various policies, but all the gaps. And it defines all the different types of abuse and neglect and exploitation. And then it sets out a framework, a suggested framework in terms of what should the legislative framework be, what should we suggest an independent safeguarding authority to regulate also and set standards and education for all other bodies in relation to safeguarding. We also actually, just to mention while I'm talking about research, the Law Reform Commission published a very detailed report last year in February of last year, again setting out the legal framework. So a lot of what we're doing at the moment, and they relied very heavily on our paper of identifying risk and sharing responsibilities. So that's a very important law reform, because that will suggest, it has a number of recommendations for both the enactment of both civil law legislation and criminal law legislation to deal with various forms of abuse, neglect and exploitation. So I leave it at that. That hopefully gives an outline of what we do. But
You've been very busy in your 10 or 11 years of existence, so you have.
yes, we have.
Indeed. So, Tim, many will think of the HSE as a rather, I don't know, monolithic organization that we only hear about in the media. So please tell us about the National Safeguarding Office, what you do, and how you came to be its manager.
Okay, so first of all, again, thanks for having me on, Travis, and delighted to be able to speak to yourself and to the listeners on the webcast. You're right, the HSE is a very large, complex organization that delivers health and social care, both for people in hospital, people in the community, and also commissions private and voluntary services to be what's called service providers. So it's a huge, large state organization. Within that, the state has taken on a role with relation to responding to abuse and neglect. And Patricia's highlighted areas where there's need for further reform and legislation. But I'll just cover the kind of here and now and what we do. And we might come on to some of the things that need to be reformed, changed, and improved. So there is social work teams called safeguarding teams, and they're spread right throughout the Republic of Ireland in 9 areas. And their role is to receive calls, emails, online referrals from anybody who's concerned about themselves, a family member, a neighbour, or friend that they might believe is at risk of abuse or harm, or seek advice from us um, in relation to older people or people with disabilities. So there's that front line. We're a national office, so we support the delivery of those 9 social work-led teams, and they're geographically located around the Republic of Ireland. Our office does other things as well around collecting data. We do deliver training and education programs. We develop practice tools and education material for our for our teams and for others. And very important, and Patricia would have referenced it there, and you did, I think you might have alluded to yourself, is that we've come out of a history in Ireland of very institutional type care. We've come out of a history of what we call congregated settings, and we're still progressing on that, and we're still to a degree reforming that, but it's left a long legacy in Ireland in the type and nature of our care and how people have choices and control and autonomy. And so it's quite important that the Health Services Executive has a monitoring role of how safeguarding is done within residential and nursing home care. And that's another aspect of what those 9 teams do. And there's further reform needed in that whole area. And as Patricia said, we operate without primary legislation, unlike some other parts. And you might have some listeners from other countries where they have more well-developed kind of legislation. But the social work teams, those 9 teams, is about 130 staff spread right around the country. Their main role is to receive reports and then to work with the person, or indeed sometimes with the person who the abuse is alleged against, because we want to find resolution that the person themselves, and I'll come on and talk a little bit later about our kind of journey of making it more person-centered, the rights of the person and the outcome that they wish for themselves. You know, I often use that phrase, they want the abuse to stop, but they might still want a relationship or contact with somebody. So that kind of nuance of how something is assessed and how a safety or protection plan is put in place. Some people have this view that, you know, you remove somebody or you remove the abuser. That may be the case in some very extreme situations, but we really want to work with the person and respect their human rights and their will and preference and the outcomes that they would look for. So we get in about 18,000 reports a year in across those 9 teams, and they're either screened within the residential or nursing home, or for community referrals, they're screened by our teams. And then out of those, we would look to see where there are reasonable grounds where we need to put in and work with the people on a safeguarding and protection plan. It is complex work. It is, and we'll come on to talk about how uncomfortable it can be, particularly where the person of concern is a carer or a family member or someone. We also deal with a stranger abuse,
Mhm.
everything from the online scams to someone who befriends someone and cocoons in their house and it doesn't. But actually, the majority of the time, the person of concern is known to the person. I would make the point, though, and I always say this when I'm invited on, is most people get up every morning well intentioned, and most people want to be good carers and family members and want and seek. But there are situations where abusive relationships can happen or can emerge over time. And we need to have the conversation around what that is, how that happens. Um, and it can happen gradually. Often people think this is a kind of we hear about the once-off appalling incidences and they happen. We hear about the awful institutional organizational situation and they happen. But there's also very small, and Patricia will know, talk about this in terms of financial abuse that can happen over time,
Mhm.
relationships that don't start out abusive, that don't start out coercive, but can emerge into that. So, you're right to call this unspeakable truth in many ways. It's about lifting the lid, often having these uncomfortable conversations. It's not easy. I don't know about your wider audience, but coming out of an Irish culture, we talk about how difficult it was. I trained as a social worker in the early 80s in Ireland. And one of my first lectures was the discovery of child sexual abuse. It had been there for hundreds of thousands of years, but we were having a lecture in Ireland in 1984 about the discovery of child sexual abuse in Ireland. I mean, we're coming out of reports. So we are still facing up to things. We're still having those conversations. We'll come on to talk about that, but that's hopefully give you a little bit of an overview
No, that's
of
very
what
good. I
my
suppose
office and what the teams do. Yeah,
suppose it's like Columbus discovering a new world that's been inhabited for eons, right?
I think
Exactly.
so. I think so.
So
Yeah, yeah.
I suppose because the two of you, we've heard some terms there. So let's start with a bit of a primer on the terms we're going to use tonight. I'll ask one of you to describe each of these terms, but of course, if the other has something to add, surely jump in. So Patricia, we'll start with you. From your organization's standpoint, it's a broad one, but abuse.
Sure, and I think it's defined in a number of different documents, but I suppose the one to start with is the HSE Safeguarding of Vulnerable Persons at Risk policy, which defines it as any act or failure to act which results in a breach of a vulnerable person's human rights, civil liberties, physical or mental integrity, dignity, or general well-being, whether intended or through negligence, including sexual relationship or financial transactions to which the person does not or cannot validly consent, or which are deliberately exploitative. And of course, it can take a variety of forms. Physical, negligence is an abuse in itself, institutional abuse, deprivation of liberty. And just to say, really, we were talking about coming to this new in a way, although it's been around for a long time. We've had a constitution which sets out rights of the individual, respect for the individual, respect for their bodily integrity, respect for the deprivation of liberty, not being put in a place of care against their will, all of that. We have ignored those constitutional rights. So when we're talking about abuse, we're talking, again, I would emphasize the respect for the person and respect for their rights. And again, just to say that, HICWA and others would define it in other ways. And indeed, just to say that the Law Reform Commission didn't define abuse, but it did define harm. And it also recommends two different forms of, offence. So harm as a civil law offence and a criminal law offence. So I think it's important in talking about abuse to talk about harm also. So harm in the civil law context is assault, ill treatment, neglect, or self-neglect in a manner that affects or is likely to affect the health, safety, or welfare of an adult at risk. And again, I suppose the language has gone from a vulnerable adult to an adult at risk. That's the more acceptable term now because people don't want to regard themselves or don't deem themselves as vulnerable. But a person who has a disability or an illness may be an adult at risk and may need help and support. But anyway, so health, safety or welfare of an adult at risk, sexual abuse of an at-risk adult, or loss of or damage to the property by theft, fraud, deception, or coercive exploitation. And it may be a single or a series or a combination of acts or omissions or circumstances. Again, omissions, if you talk about the Grace case, the omissions in our care, the neglect in our care, our teeth needed. And we come across in Safeguarding Ireland, we get a lot of referrals to us. We signpost to other people, and particularly people who are old and frail, the lack of audio service or optical service or dental care. It's neglect, it's omission on their care. So on the criminal side, then it's harm to a body or mind, which includes pain or unconsciousness, any injury or impairment of physical, mental, intellectual, emotional health or welfare, or any form of property or financial loss. Now, the reason for that distinction is that, of course, the law reform recommends new offences in relation to harm and abuse. And it's really important then if it is spelt out as a criminal offence or a civil law offence. So just, and again, we can come to financial abuse, which again has different forms and whatever.
Yeah, and we would definitely do. And even in the description there, in the definition, if you will,
yes.
There were some terms that we need to go further into. So Tim, neglect, from the HSE's point of view, what would be the definition of neglect as we use it tonight?
Yeah, so neglect is seen as an act or an omission, and where you could ignore someone's health needs, their medical needs, their physical care needs, and it's a failure to act. It's a failure to act sometimes to provide someone, and not just to meet those needs, but access to them. So we come across sometimes to their social care needs, to their education needs, and it's often in the withholding of things. And it can combine with psychological abuse as well, where someone is the deprivation, say, of their house heating or their nutrition or their food is used as a way of controlling or manipulating them, so that the somebody it doesn't have access. But it's either an act or an omission, and very often it's in sort of, it could be a deliberate ignoring or a failure to follow up on a need that somebody has. It does get a bit more complex, and we can come on to talk about that in terms of the whole concept of responsibility, and where the responsibility lies, particularly within families. But we can see the indicators of it, and Patricia referenced there the Grace case, which was there was clear evidence there in terms of dental care. We know it in people's hair, their nails, their tissue, and it's not just the kind of big items where somebody was stopped from getting their medication. It can also be control around access to family members. We're often involved in some of our cases where one family member deprives another family member from having a social relationship, or bringing somebody out to meet the other family members, or going to events, or the access to and I suppose if you think about it, for you and your members and the people you support, living socially valued lives is so important for anybody with a physical or health condition. So it combines a lot of those. So you're giving you some of the examples and indicators as well as kind of a definition.
Great. No, I appreciate that. And one final one, Patricia. It's fairly new on the books, I suppose, but coercive control. I mean, I think most of us get the idea, but what would that be in practical terms?
Sure. And again, I'll give you the definition that's used in our identifying risks and sharing responsibility. Just to say to you, Ireland did introduce a new offence of coercive control into the domestic violence legislation in 2018, the Domestic Violence Act of 2018. But it actually is limited to a person who is or has been in an intimate relationship. So the offence in the Domestic Violence Act doesn't extend to other situations. So in other words, an adult child abusing a parent or indeed a neighbour or whatever. So the definition then and we come across it quite a bit, is coercive control is a pattern of behaviour which is designed to exert control over another person. It is used with intent by an abuser to make a person dependent, to isolate them in order to exploit them, to deprive them of their independence, and to exercise control over their behaviour and choices. Again, we did in Safeguarding Ireland a Red C poll. And in fact, in terms of making decision on behalf of another person, that's another form of control. And 67% of Irish people felt it was in order for another person to make a decision on behalf of another person, a person who was old and frail, without their consent. So that's a controlling situation or behaviour. It happens a lot in the finance area as well. And again, during COVID, the government here, when people were cocooning, everybody was, I suppose, who were cocooning, particularly older people, were encouraged to hand over control of their finances to another person. Again, we did a survey after the end of COVID and found that many people had never taken back control and they were being coercively or financially exploited. Again, the Lower Reform Commission has again suggested a new offence of financial exploitation. So people that control another person's finances. And we find many times that a person who is in a vulnerable situation or a person who is at risk, financial abuse is one of the many things that happens to them. They've no control over spending on their care or the service they need to get. So coercive control is, again, as I say, it's an offence that happens quite a bit for at-risk adults. And again, it is, again, we did, Safeguarding Ireland did another piece of research recently and found that actually it's perpetrated, particularly financial exploitation, is perpetrated by mainly 87% of the people you know. So it occurs very much within families. So again, we have, as I say, the offence in Irish legislation, but it's very limited. And so we need that expanded. And people, again, in those vulnerable situations or family situations should realise, again, who do they trust, in managing their money or their assets? Who do they rely on to access services for them and all of that? And again, as Tim mentioned, the whole question of not allowing the people to see their family members or controlling who a person will see, taking a person's phone, managing that phone, and not allowing them to speak to friends or whatever. So it is a fairly endemic form of abuse, and we don't often recognise it. So it does really need to be absolutely named on the statute book, and those offences need to be put in place.
Thank you very much, both of you, for that, because they're terms that we think we know, but obviously from reading the law and your experiences, they go farther in depth. As we move on, please don't hesitate to send your questions in via the questions tab, and we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. Tim, let's just say that I think I might be experiencing something like coercive control or being taken advantage of financially, but I'm not really sure. And let's say that it's by a family member, so I don't want to call the guards and make a real hames of my home life, etc. How can I be sure or at least know when to elevate that conversation?
Yeah, I would give a certain advice to certainly try and identify somebody that you can trust, be it a family member or a health professional, but also to think about the behaviors you're seeing. Think about that relationship, and is there something that you're feeling isn't right about the level of control, the level of influence? You're being deprived of something, something that you'd got control over, or even down to, comments. Like if you think somebody's persistently, been humiliating you, sarcasm, depriving you in some way, bullying, it doesn't always have to be, and we sometimes see, pressure to make decisions. And sometimes a thing called outpacing, which is putting pressure on someone to make decisions and sign things and putting them in a where they have to make decisions very rapidly, and they lose a bit of control. So again, we always say to people, try and think what you're seeing, and can you identify it? And who do you trust? Also, you can come and talk to us in the HSE safeguarding teams uh, to make what we call a guidance call. You can ask us for advice, and I know you've put up on your questions box the contact details. And for those of you outside of Ireland, um, there are services like duty social work for adult safeguarding services, or if you're involved with a mental health team or a social care service or a health service, seek out the advice. There's some good information on our website. There's some good information on Safeguarding Ireland's website around what to look out for, what to spot. Again, if it's financial abuse, how you'd see things that, in terms of managing your account, your benefits, and things that might be a red flag to you. Talk to someone you trust. If you can't find someone in your family, can you reach out to a healthcare professional that you trust, a nurse or a doctor, or a health and social care professional, or come to a adult safeguarding team. You won't be put under pressure to make a direct report or referral. You can go for advice and guidance, and then talk through with you if you want to make a formal referral and formal interventions. But seek out the information. Talk to someone you trust, talk to the services. Obviously, if it's something immediate and serious, contact the police. If you feel that you're at immediate and serious risk of harm or abuse or theft or assault, don't wait about. The guards in Ireland, as our police force in Ireland, now have protective services units right throughout the country that are specially trained police who are given additional training and resourcing in the area, particularly in the area of sexual offences and dealing with vulnerable people who are making reports of abuse. So yeah, I don't be scared. It can be a big step for some people, stepping outside and making that phone call.
Can I come
Patricia,
in
that's
there?
something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, it's really important. And again, our experience in Safeguarding Ireland is that people, particularly service providers, don't really understand that they have an obligation to report abuse.
It's funny, I was just going to get onto the concept with you
So,
there of a
yeah,
mandated person or a mandated
yes.
reporter.
So under the Disclosure of Information Act, it's an offence not to disclose an abuse, particularly sexual abuse, or against a vulnerable adult or a child. And actually, after one of our awful cases, the Brandon case or whatever, a review was done, and it was found that many of the professionals weren't aware that they had that obligation to report their abuse, that abuse. So it's really, really important. Also, there is the and again, this arises a lot in terms of financial abuse. There is the Criminal Law Justice Act, Section 19 of 2011. Again, it's an offence if you have reasonable belief that an abuse or an offence is going to be committed. You're obliged, again, to report that to the police. And again, we in Safeguarding Ireland come across a lot of situations where something certainly person's money has been taken, their care hasn't been paid for, or whatever. And again, maybe the family member has reported to the department, but hasn't reported to the police. So while the pension may have been reinstated or whatever, but the abuse or the offence has never been reported. And that, of course, can continue. So it's really important that, as I say, services and others understand there is an obligation to report. Also, if you're talking about financial abuse, There is, again, the central bank have just produced, and it's really, again, another piece of information that they have updated their Consumer Protection Code, which they only published there 25th of March, updated Consumer Protection Code. It now updates all the financial service providers' regulations. And again, taking account of some of the proposals of the Law Reform Commission, that again, a financial service provider can take action to stop payment out an account or whatever, again, if they've reasonable belief that an abuse is taking place. So there's been a lot of developments recently, but it's really important that people know about those developments and really have information as who to report to. So again, in terms of pensions being misused or collected, somebody being acting as the agent for a person collecting their pension or their benefit, their disability benefit, pocketing that or not paying for the services or the care of that individual. Again, they can obviously report to the department. And again, we do not have, by our Department of Social Protection, a good oversight in terms of monitoring people that they appoint as agents for collecting pension and benefits. That's an outstanding issue that does need to be addressed. Also, people can report directly to the bank or the credit union, or again to, as Tim says, the HSE safeguarding teams. There are also bodies such as a person with a disability can get in touch with the National Advocacy Service, and for older people, Sage Advocacy. Sage Advocacy, the two highest issues that they deal with are financial abuse and also deprivation of liberty, putting a person into a home without their care. Both those advocacy services act independently of family, independently of service. And again, if people need that independent advocate to be their voice, actually to be their voice, it is really an important. Again, we are looking to have independent advocacy, a statutory provision to the recognition of independent advocacy, but all the regulations for nursing homes, for care, for hospital, again, HICWA regulations, all provide, as indeed does the Decision Support Service, have codes of practice and standards for independent advocacy. So that advocate can be your lifeline, and they will,
and it's not just, a whole pension checker, etc. This is,
yes.
If you can't get out to the shop to get a liter of milk and you give somebody 20 quid and they don't give you the change,
yes.
It might be a mistake the first time, but if it continues, this is financial abuse of someone who is vulnerable I suppose I go back as well, and this is just a comment of in a number of different iterations of my life with MS. I've been in contact with a lot of people, and often you find that people are they're of the opinion, or they're frightened enough to think that a bad relationship, even an abusive relationship, is better than no relationship at all, because they think if I'm out of this house, I'm homeless, and certainly we have those issues in Ireland. Yeah. But I want to move on now. Many of our people listening might be reluctant to take a first step. They might be listening to this for the first time, and so let's do a little bit of signposting, as both of your organizations might do. Tim, if someone's watching us tonight and they're experiencing one of the situations that we've defined earlier, from the HSE's perspective, what should they do? Who should be their first person to contact from the HSE's point of view?
So if somebody wants to make a formal referral, if they're in a nursing home or they're in a residential centre, they should be person in charge or designated officer. Somebody say they're living in any care arrangement. And that we ask and expect, as does the regulator, that names are up on a wall, pictures are up on a wall for people with communication difficulties, for who is the assigned person within what we call a residential or a nursing home. If someone's out in the community, as I said, they can come direct to a health professional, or they can contact us directly, and you put up the contact numbers. We're very mindful that often the most difficult thing is the first call. The most challenging thing is to start that conversation. because there may not be an ally. There may not be a trusted person. If there's an ally and a trusted person, and you touched on something there a minute ago, I think is really important. And we've World Elder Abuse Day coming up, Awareness Day coming up in June. And one of the things we're highlighting this year is the connection between social isolation, loneliness, and abuse. And there's been international research that says that somebody who doesn't have social connection, who lacks an ally, and we certainly know this from our figures, as people become older and poorer and more isolated, they're at more risk of, be it financial abuse, psychological abuse, or even physical abuse. So the point is that if there isn't that trusted person immediately, if there isn't that ally, that don't try not to be scared of picking the phone up. And again, as I said, the Gardaís are important as well, because sometimes it could be, someone has been assaulted and someone has had a theft. Those are crimes, and it's really important. And the guards are putting in much more emphasis now on being more responsive and trying to be, victim centric. So we want to put more of an emphasis. We also do have an online digital presence as well, as something will be further and developed, because we do know some people actually find the conversation difficult. Something we discovered during COVID, actually, that some people actually found an online contact. It should never replace the phone. It should never replace, picking up the phone to a duty social worker or a human voice. But for some people, the first point of contact, and I was a duty social worker for a long time myself, and I was always minded that I didn't know when anybody picked that phone up what they had, where they were, and what were their experiencing, and were they at that moment in fear, or were they able to speak? Because certainly the dynamic of domestic violence, which we briefly touched on, people's ability to be able to speak openly and frankly, particularly if it's in a family context, maybe somebody watching the phone. We know now that our domestic violence colleagues tells us that they have this quick switch off on their phone apps if somebody is checking out domestic violence services. So we have to be very mindful of a person who might have reached out for the first time, but we're trying to tell people, don't be scared of making that contact. Whatever is there in our culture and our background in Ireland, and maybe there are in other cultures and other backgrounds, and it might feel uncomfortable and it might not be easy to make that contact. But we'd certainly encourage, support anybody to do that. As I said, but also think about who your trusted person is in your family or health professional.
If I could come in there again, Trevis, just on the whole question of, it is really difficult for a person who is at risk and who may be ill, may be frail, may be old, may be going through a mental health blip, to actually take the initiative themselves. So in many cases, they are reliant on that trusted person. But unfortunately, in many cases, that trusted person is the controller. And that's a huge issue that as a society, we have to clearly address. And therefore, people, and we find, in Safeguarding Ireland, there are many people, as you say, have nobody. And where they have a trusted person, the family dysfunction or dynamics are all fighting against one another. That's another issue that needs to be addressed. So I would say to try and reach out to an advocate, an independent advocate, or services, or obviously the safeguarding and protection teams, or other bodies. The Gardaí now, under their new community services, and they're working again around different areas, they will make welfare checks as well. We get the Gardaí to do a lot of welfare checks in situations that we find that we may have somebody that is really in a very bad situation and has nobody to help them. And we would ask the Gardaí to do a welfare check. And I know social workers will do welfare checks as well. But all I'm saying is that sometimes the trusted person isn't the trusted person You know, they may be the controller, they may be the person that's financially abused, they may be the person who is isolating you from others and all of the rest. And we have to address that as a society. And that's why we need that legal framework, you know, to address all of that, but also to acknowledge that it needs to be addressed. That's really important.
So we have a question coming in specifically to that. So there is the children's protection. When can we expect adult safeguarding legislation? Certainly, now the iron is hot for striking after the Grace report.
Yes.
So when is that in the committee stages now, or
No. I'll tell you where it's at. The Law Reform Commission, as I said, published their 1,000-page report last year, and also produced a civil law bill and a criminal law bill. We in Safeguarding Ireland have, and one of their recommendations was that an intersectoral body or interdisciplinary body should be set up to see to the implementation of that legislation. We in Safeguarding Ireland say that intersectoral body should be set up now to see to the enactment of the legislation. So we've been doing the rounds with government departments, and even before the election, and indeed since, who have that conversation commence. And indeed, we've spoken to quite a number of departments who are positive about that. And Department of Justice in particular, and Health and Social Protection and Children Integration or whatever. And Justice were leading on giving departments their homework to do to analyse the Law Reform Commission's report, say by the end of 2025. And we're pushing for that. And we're pushing for other organisations to look at and drive the enactment of that legislation. So by the end of this year, hopefully we'll see maybe a consultation paper by a group of departments, by lead department or whoever. And it will take, I suspect, it'll take at least 2 years by the time we're through the Dáil, the Oireachtas committee stage and all the rest. But I would encourage everybody to really be very, very adamant that we need this legislation sooner rather than later. We can't continue at the level we're at the moment. Even within the HSE teams, you find lack of consistency or whatever. And really, we find that people really don't know where to go to. Where does the buck stop? Who is accountable? Who has the responsibility? And we've no overarching body. And we don't have, for example, as they do have in other jurisdictions, a body that has the responsibility for carrying out serious case reviews. We spend a lot of money on investigations and legal fees and everything, but it hasn't achieved a whole lot yet in terms of that framework that we need.
Okay, that's right. I mean, 2 years is better than 3 years, I suppose.
Yeah.
Excuse me, Tim. We talked about the person feeling neglected, abused, etc. Let's suppose that a friend or a family member might observe the sort of abuse, neglect being perpetrated on their friend, on their cousin, on their auntie. Yeah. Do you have many people reach out in that case? And if so, do you diagnose them differently?
So you mean a neighbor or family member who sees the indicator?
That's it. Yeah.
Well, you know, Patricia would have referenced there. We don't see a huge number of people directly reporting abuse themselves. Often it actually comes from a concerned family member, concerned neighbor, concerned friend. And actually that's really, really important. And as well as the need for the law to reform and be updated, we actually need a whole societal, cultural change. So we'll obviously follow the law. But there's a problem in Irish culture of not reporting your neighbor, your family. Like, we have to try and get beyond that somewhat, and why and how those barriers are there. That and Patricia was talking there about some of the Red C polls, and we know by international research our prevalence rates, we should be seeing much higher rates of reports. People do report family services. We obviously have to deal with that difficult dynamic that's there, where families are in dispute, or there's maybe counter allegations or minimization between family members. But it's really important that those close to family, those close to the person, who have direct experience, direct knowledge of the person, particularly if you're seeing something that's not right. And it could be that, deprivation of something, or a financial thing, or control of their medication, control of their visitation, their heating, their lighting in the house, that that sense of responsibility to do something. And families also need to find ways to have those difficult conversations and find ways to come forward. It is, what I believe we need both. We had a report done in the Health Service Executive after the case called the Emily case. And one of the strong things that Jackie McElroy found in that was the need at all levels to address culture and a kind of our acceptance or minimization, or almost in that particular one, which was a very serious case involving rape and sexual harm of an older person, the disbelief. This kind of thing. Oh, it couldn't happen. It just couldn't happen. That we have to break down some of those barriers. And you talk about the unspeakable things and the uncomfortable truths. As I said, most people are well intentioned and most people do want to be good carers, but awful things can and do happen. I suppose the more we have the conversation about it, the more we accept it. And that's why I go back to my thing about in the early 1980s when I started training as a social worker, we were only wakening up in many ways to the unspeakable truth that children were harmed in schools and institutions. We're still at an early stage of accepting it and acknowledging that this happens, and that and there's sometimes a kind of a knee-jerk reaction maybe to minimize it, or to call it something else and use different language, when actually if someone has experienced harm and it's abusive, then we need to try and understand what that
So
is and
a
use the
neighbor or
right
a family
language.
member should reach out the same way through the HSE's.
Of course, absolutely. Or as Patricia said, there's organisations there to support. But I think within families as well, there's a need to, have greater conversations about, things that are happening, their future, what's happening, if they're concerned about things over time. That could be, you see, something like, say, neglect just doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
It can, but it rarely does. Or patterns of coercive control happen over time. They happen gradually, often, and the messaging around that within a family, because sometimes silence. Um, there's a saying, what I tolerate, I promote. Sometimes if you see, so that is a difficult message that we just need to start talking about. Have we seen something happen over time that could, and rightly, there's a big focus on when things go wrong, and particularly the big inquiries, and the unspeakable, awful, serious harm. There's also those things that happen gradually. They happen over time. There's no one awful incident.
Right.
Um,
It's
but
kind of
also,
creepy.
yeah, also if a person has issues arising, about themselves, and they feel under pressure, abuse, coercion, again, tap into anybody. If they're visiting the GP, alert the GP. If they're meeting a public health nurse, say to the public health nurse. If they're going to the bank, mention it to the bank. All the banks now have, at-risk vulnerable customers units and whatever. So take every opportunity that they can to alert somebody. And as Tim says, it's a cultural thing, but it's a culture in professions as well. We don't see what we should see.
I'll
So the
give a
Meals
very
on
good
Wheels calling, the volunteer calling, take every opportunity,
opportunity.
tap into whatever.
I'll give a very good practical example of culture change, Trevis. I worked for many years in child protection, and we talk about where people come to A&E departments with physical injuries, or when people come into the doctor. And for many years, the medical people asked the nurses to be the ones reporting it. Although they saw it, they observed it, and they had the medical knowledge and expertise to say that was a non-accidental injury or whatever. When children first came in, we saw a sea change over time, where because it was legislatively, and there was a lot of rigor and due diligence brought upon it, that we saw the change in medical people taking greater responsibility to, if I'm the first person seeing it, if I've got the physical signs and I've the professional judgment, don't pass that on to someone else. Now, that was a culture that was around when I started, pass it to someone else. It used to be like, give it to the public health nurse or pass it, it's almost pass a little bit of parts to parcel. Whereas actually, if I've seen something, and we talked earlier on about that professional responsibility to report. Patricia would have touched on the withholding of Information Act, but I have a primary professional duty, and we kind of concentrate also on culture change within the health services, within social care services, that we tolerated things or minimized things or maybe passed it along. So I'm just making that point that culture change with legislative change both need to happen to really make an impact.
Yeah, and I suppose something you said early on was really important for people to hear, because we need to know what success looks like, and we don't have a lot of time to go into it. But certainly, you mentioned, Tim, that very rarely do you completely remove the person or the offender. It can happen, certainly.
There can be legal interventions.
A lot of people, they won't report because they'll think, oh no, that means I won't have a place to live, and certainly that's difficult. So success can be a lot of things, and I suspect that this is just the first of many of these conversations that we'll have around this, because there's so much more to talk about. We haven't had a lot of questions come in because I think it's a little overwhelming just to even hear about, let alone to talk about. But our time goes at pace always in these things, and we have covered a lot, not enough. But there's more.
Could I just mention a very important piece of legislation? I've mentioned it a couple of times, and again, people who are ill, and may have difficulty getting support or whatever. The Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act, which commenced in 2023, people can. There are 3 different levels in that. So, and in some cases, people may arrive at a situation where they may lack capacity to make decisions. But even before that, where they get a diagnosis of something, they may need to get help from somebody. So there are 3 different levels. So they can appoint a decision-making assistant to help them get information, interpret information. The next level up is a co-decision maker. Again, to get information, but also to help them make the decision that they need to make. And then if a person lacks capacity, that's a very important piece of legislation, because some people who are ill go through various different levels of decision making or not being able to make decisions. So it's really important that people know about that legislation in the different tiers. And of course, a lot of information can be got from the website of the Decision Support Service, all of that. And again, I would say the greatest protection for people to protect themselves are entering into those arrangements under the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act, where at time in the future, they may not be in a position to make decisions for themselves. So really important, the greatest protection. And then the selection of that trusted person, really, really important who it is. Is it really that trusted person? So really important.
It's all of this has been so important, and I can't thank you enough. Our time has quickly come to an end, and there is a lot more to discuss on this topic. But with my MS fatigue and all, we have to know when to say when. And for those who are listening as well, I can't thank you enough. I thank Patricia Rickard-Clarke of Safeguarding Ireland and Tim Hanley of the HSE's National Safeguarding Offices. You've been most generous with your time this evening and helpful with your knowledge, of course. Please, for our listeners, do plan on our next program, which is Thursday, May the 15th, again at 7 p.m. Irish time. Our panel of experts will talk about finding new doctors when yours retires, perhaps, when you move home, or maybe when you just don't get on with your neurologist. Until then, I'm Trevis Gleason, wishing you and your family the very best of health. Back to you, Fergal, and cheers. Fergal, you're muted. And cheers again.
Talking to myself there. So I want to thank Patricia and Tim for a really powerful talk tonight. And again, I reiterate that on our YouTube channel next week, we'll be putting up this, and I'm sure this is something that people will go to for many years to come. There was so much information there that people get, and I think it's a topic that we could definitely come back to again. So I want to thank you, Patricia and Tim, again, and again, Trevis, for hosting this. So, and also I'll put up the link next week on our social media for the one for our next Unspeakable Bits on the 15th of May. So again, thank you everybody for a really powerful talk and informative talk tonight. Take care.
Cheers.
Thank you
Bye.
for inviting us. Thank
Good
you.
night.
Take care.
Good night.